Welcome to our Zoom lessons on the writings of the Apostle Paul. My name is Jamie Knapp, and in this lesson, we will look at Colossians. Let's begin by sharing the screen and going to the PowerPoint slides. In previous lessons, we've looked at 1 Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians, Galatians, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Romans, and most recently, we looked at Ephesians. Ephesians is the first of what are known as prison epistles. Ephesians, Colossians, Philemon, and Philippians. Paul was a prisoner in Rome for a 2-year period of time, and it's during those 2 years that scholars believe he wrote these 4 letters. In our lesson focused on Ephesians, I provided more detail about how Paul had made it from Jerusalem to Rome, where he was in prison. And we should point out that Paul was not in a dungeon. He was not in a prison cell. He was under house arrest. He was living in a private residence, but there was a Roman soldier with him at all times. And so without at all attempting to diminish the fact that Paul was a prisoner and that his movement was limited, he was not in the kind of miserable conditions we might think of when we would think of being chained to a wall in a dungeon. So people could come and go. They could visit with Paul. They could take care of his needs. They could bring him additional food. They could just visit with him. They could bring him clothing. They could bring him writing materials and just information from the various places where Paul had preached. And so during that 2-year period of time, between 60 AD and 62 AD, is when most scholars believe the prison epistles were written. In today's lesson, we want to focus on Colossians. The city of Colossae was located about 120 miles east of Ephesus. There was also a town nearby known as Laodicea. There was another town close to Colossae known as Hierapolis. And collectively, these 3 cities, which are referenced in chapter 4 of Colossians, verse 13, we could call kind of a tri-cities area. They were close enough to one another that there was some connection between all 3 of them. With no disrespect to the people who lived in Colossae, of those 3 cities, Colossae was the least significant in terms of its size, in terms of its economic impact. Laodicea was a much more prosperous town or city than Colossae. Colossae itself was a small agrarian town. It was located on a major highway that ran from northwest to southeast, but there was not a whole lot that really stood out about Colossae, with one exception. There was something about the water or the soil in that area that made the wool that came from sheep have a very, very distinct color. And so that sort of became the calling card of Colossae. That's what made it unique in what otherwise was a fairly nondescript city. Paul did not plant the church in Colossae. We're told in Acts chapter 19, verse 10, that Paul had spent a lot of time in Ephesus. And all who lived in Asia heard the word of the Lord. And again, Asia is Asia Minor, not Asia as in China, Japan, Korea, etc., in Asia Minor. And so Paul himself had not gone to Colossae to plant the church. But what scholars believe happened was a man by the name of Epaphras had traveled to Ephesus. He heard the gospel. He became a believer, and then he returned to his home in Colossae, and he began teaching. And so it was Epaphras that planted the church in Colossae. You can see that in chapter 1, verse 7 of Colossians, rather than Paul. But trouble was brewing in the church at Colossae. And so Epaphras had traveled all the way to Rome to visit Paul And he explained to Paul what was taking place in Colossae. And upon hearing this, Paul decided that it would be very good for him to write a letter that could then be taken to the church in Colossae. And the letter has two main themes. The first theme is that Christ is sufficient. That's chapter 1 through chapter 3, verse 4. And then the remaining part of Colossians focuses on the Christian life. Colossians only has 4 chapters, and so it's not a particularly long letter. So let's begin with the Christ is sufficient part. Apparently, there were some members of the church in Colossae who were starting to follow a very influential or charismatic individual who lived in Colossae. And this man was convincing people that they had to supplement their faith in Jesus with angel worship. And they had to tap into some spiritual forces beyond what Jesus could provide. And as part of this, they had to go through some extensive fasting, and there were certain taboo things that they had to stay away from, and there were certain kinds of foods they couldn't eat, etc. And Paul's message to the church at Colossae is very clear, and that is, don't fall for this. I know it sounds good. I know it sounds impressive, and it seems like it's a good idea, but he says this doesn't add anything to your salvation. Paul says, rely solely on Jesus Christ. This is a similar theme to what we saw in Galatians, when Paul said, salvation comes through Jesus Christ, period, not Jesus Christ plus other things. He's saying the same thing to the church in Colossae. Salvation comes through Jesus Christ. And then in the first chapter of Colossians, Paul includes several statements that are reminding the Christians in Colossae of just how significant Jesus is. He says he, Jesus, is the image of the invisible God. All the fullness of Almighty God lives in Jesus Christ. God made everything right. He reconciled everything to himself through Jesus Christ. And because of Jesus, we can stand before God as ones who are holy and blameless. Jesus is sufficient. The second main theme of this letter has to do with just living out the Christian life. Chapter 3, verses 12 through 13. Be kind, be humble, be gentle, be patient, be forgiving. Devote yourself to prayer, he says in chapter 4, verse 2. There are instructions given for how wives and husbands are to live and interact with one another. Instructions for children, instructions for fathers, for slaves, for masters. Chapter 4, verses 5 and 6. Instructions for how people who are believers in Jesus should behave around people who are not believers in Jesus. And finally, in chapter 4, Paul includes some personal greetings in verses 7 through 18. And then there are two very interesting things for us to consider. The first is Paul makes reference to a letter that he wrote to the church in Laodicea. And Paul tells the Colossians, now, once you've read the letter I wrote to you, I want you to give it to the church in Laodicea so they can read it. And I want you to read the letter that I wrote to the church in Laodicea. Well, in our New Testament, we don't have a letter to the Laodiceans. You can see in Revelation chapter 2 that the church at Laodicea was one of the 7 churches that the angels spoke to and spoke about, but we don't have the letter that Paul wrote to the Laodiceans. Scholars have not been able to find a copy of that. And then there's a name, Onesimus. Chapter 4, verse 9. As Paul is greeting different individuals in chapter 4, he makes reference to Onesimus. And he doesn't say anything else about Onesimus. He just mentions his name very briefly and then goes on. But the name Onesimus is going to mean a great deal to us when we look at the next letter in the prison epistles. Now, let me stop sharing this screen. And before we close, let me switch to a different screen so we can get our geographic bearings. Again, Paul is in Rome now as a prisoner, and Colossae is over here. Here's Asia Minor, this province. We've mentioned Ephesus here, and Colossae, and we even mentioned Laodicea here. Hierapolis is not showing on the map, but it would have been kind of in this vicinity as well. And so the letters were written here, and then they were transported to this area. Well, that's our introduction to Paul's letter to the church at Colossae. It's a short letter, only 4 chapters. It can be easily read in one sitting. I hope you'll do so this week. I hope you'll spend some time looking through and reading this letter. In our next lesson, we will look at a very unique letter known as Philemon. I hope you can join us.